Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third Organizing 101 workshop. My name is Chris Blankenhorn. I am the Illinois Green Party Secretary, a former national co-chair for the Green Party of the United States, and I served as Howie Hawkins and Angela Walker's social media and tech director during the 2020 campaign. Since then, I've been working with the Green Socialist Organizing Project and primarily running our education program with Garrett here. I'll let Garrett introduce himself and then we will dive in.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Garrett Wasserman, and I'm a current GPUS steering committee co-chair, as well as involved in my Green Party of Pennsylvania's ballot access efforts and campaigns. And so I'm looking forward to our discussion today on organizing and talking about all of our experience with doing things like campaigns and ballot access.
Awesome. Yeah. So like we said, this is our Organizing 101 workshop. This is the third time that we've done this Organizing 101 workshop. It's part of a broader 101 series that we've been doing monthly. You can find out more about those at greensocialist.net/101s, including seeing, past videos, past slideshows, stuff like that. This third time through, we're changing it up a little. This Organizing 101, the past two times we've done it has been a lot about organizing theory in the abstract. We said at the beginning of our second one that one of the works that we chose to highlight as a model is Foster's organizing in the steel industry. So we did our Organizing 101, our first one back in March, and literally within a week of us doing it, there was an interview with the organizer for the Amazon Union in New York, and they were asked what was their model, right? What did they use to organizing to successfully organize the warehouse in New York? And the response was Foster's organizing the steel industry, right? So we're talking about almost a century-old document that was focused on bottom-up union organizing. And when we talk about a lot of the kind of organizing theories that we get into in this workshop, one thing we always make sure to say is that there's not a lot of information out there, right? There's not a lot of resources out there if you're looking to organize an independent socialist organization. A lot of the resources, a lot of the training programs you can do, like Wellstone, they generally focus on the not-for-profit, industry, or it's often called the not-for-profit industrial complex, because we have these massive not-for-profits that suck all the money and air out of the room, and that's generally where organizing materials and resources point to, either there or directly into the Democratic Party. Right, which most of those not-for-profits, whether directly or indirectly, are engaging in that funneling of energy and organizing into the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of stuff out there if you want to organize mainstream not-for-profit oriented, mainstream Democratic oriented work, but there's not a lot if you're looking to do independent socialist organizing. So a lot of the things you'll hear us talk about may not be specifically made for the work we're doing, but it can be adapted. The things that can be taken and tweaked in a way that makes it bottom up instead of top down, because that is something that tends to come with those more mainstream democratic oriented training models and organizing models, is they tend to be top down because they're operating within a top down system. So there's some tweaks that need to be said. We're going to be using a slideshow. It gets a little dense at times, so I am putting a copy of it into the chat. So it'll be there later. It'll be in the description of this YouTube video and stuff like that. So You'll be able to find it other places, but if when we start going, you want to see something a little longer than we have it, or you can't quite read it, it's in the chat there. So I guess we'll just get started. Organizing 101, how to build a local party. Like I said in the past, we have largely done, more academic. Academic's the wrong word, but more theoretical workshops on organizing, right? Some organizing models, some things that you might want to use, some ideas, some tips, some strategies, but we haven't put them into a really, practical setting yet. We were just kind of laying the groundwork. So what we've changed this time is Garrett and I are basically going to pretend to start a local, right? In Garrett's case, I would, in my personal opinion, Garrett's in the best local in the country for the Green Party in Allegheny County in Pittsburgh. Pre-COVID, there might have been some other locals that, I would say could challenge Allegheny's, superiority in that way, or in that race. But COVID really devastated the Green Party. It really devastated our locals. And so one thing before we do start, while Garrett and I will be pretending we're kind of starting from scratch, if you have a local that's kind of bogged down, right, or isn't doing the things that you want it to do, all of this stuff is applicable, right? All of this stuff is, all of this stuff can be taken and applied to an existing party to kind of reorient how you do it. If you've got questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. We will probably stop a few times and take questions, but Garrett and I are both generally pretty good at seeing them as they come and taking them. Yeah. So with that, we will get started. And we'll start with the basic question: why should you form a local party? Coming out of the 2020 election, we formed the Green Socialist Organizing Project. And in the kind of foundational piece that called for the founding of the organization, Howie and Angela said, we need to build a political party that brings issues and constituencies around a common program and mutual support. The path forward to becoming a major party in U.S. politics is from the bottom up. We must build a mass membership party rooted in strong local chapters that can elect thousands to local office, and on that foundation to state legislatures and the House as we go into the 2020s. So in our opinion, the question why form a local party is because it's the most important thing for us to do as Greens if we want to build power long term, right? There's no shortcuts to organizing. There's no gimmicks that can get us through long term, right? That you might see a boost short term from something like a celebrity candidate, right? But if you're not doing the fundamental material organizing on the ground, that boost is just going to fade away because you don't have the ability to take on new people into the party, which is the long-term structure, right? So why should we do it? Most elected offices in the U.S., and there's a lot of them, like 500,000, right, are local offices. So most of the races that we could be running for as Greens, whether partisan or not, are on the local level, right? There's about 500, to just very loosely round. There's 500 on the federal level, right? In states, you maybe have a few more hundred for state level. Legislature and stuff like that, state level, cabinet positions if those are elected in your state. The rest of them, thousands upon thousands in every state, are local offices, school boards, park boards, city council, right? There's education, but there's road districts and education boards. And, if you're in California or Texas, they have some crazy ones like, railroad commissioner, which actually in Texas regulates a whole lot of stuff, including, I believe, the oil industry, right? In California, there are, basically recreation boards that are oriented around tourism and things like that. So there's a lot of things to get involved in. It's easier to get on the ballot for a lot of these races. It's easier to run a campaign on a local scale. right? Once you start running statewide and federal offices, we're talking, you have to have a serious operation if you're going to compete. You've got to get hundreds of thousands of votes if you're running for, Congress or something like that. And that takes a lot of work. That takes a team, that takes a party to support you, right? So local campaigns can provide a stepping stone to those larger campaigns. They allow you to build relationships. They allow you to build skills and experience. And then after you've ran them and hopefully seen some success in local campaigns, and we'll talk later about what success means, because it doesn't necessarily mean winning. But once you've done that, it's a lot easier to jump up to a state house, and then from there jump up to a U.S. house, and then from there jump up to a Senate or a gubernatorial campaign, right? We can use these local races as stepping stones to get to the larger ones. Another really important point is elected officials can bring real change in their communities, right? And they can even be a driving force in shifting policy and politics nationally. In a local office, you can more easily push through your ideas compared to being the lone green in Congress, right? It's not the squad isn't even alone, right? As representatives of the progressive flank of the Democratic Party. But even with, half a dozen to a dozen of them, they have no power, right? They were completely bulldozed on the Build Back Better and the continuing resolutions that came out of that, right? They got promises that that if they backed the infrastructure bill, they would make sure that the social spending bill was attached, and it wasn't, even after they were promised, right? So even if we win a U.S. House seat, if we're alone, then we just end up caucusing with the Democratic Party, like Bernie Sanders, right? We get lost in the sauce, we get sucked up. But on the local level, it's a lot easier to push through ideas, right? If you want to get something passed in Congress, you need hundreds of votes to support you. If you want to get something passed, even on a big city council like Chicago, right? 26 votes wins. That's all you need to move. So it's a whole lot easier, whether it be through, political or popular, citizen pressure, or just the backroom dealings that are politics, right? It's a lot easier to push ideas through on the local level. And it can be a testing ground to prove the viability of our policy ideas, right? So we can say, look, no, it works, right? We pushed through a municipal broadband, and look what it did. It massively increased access. It drove down prices, right? And so we can use it as a test case for those things. And there are examples of Greens successfully doing that, right? I think it's New Plots. New York had a green mayor before gay marriage was legal. He just started marrying people as the justice of the peace, right? And he got in trouble for doing it, right? And where the marriage is legal, probably technically not, because it was illegal in New York at the time. But it brought the issue to the forefront, and it moved the needle on it, right? And he was able to do that because he was the elected official, and he was officially a justice of this peace, and he could marry you, right? And so he did it, and he said, screw New York law. New York law is homophobic and bigoted, and anyone should be able to marry who they want. And he was able to unilaterally push it. Gail McLaughlin is another example of a green mayor, really pushing changes during the housing crisis in the late aughts. Gail McLaughlin was a mayor in California. She used eminent domain to take over houses publicly that were going to be foreclosed on to stop the families from getting kicked out, right? She was able to completely reorganize their police department and orient it towards a community control of the police foundation, and it massively reduced crime, right? Massively reduced violent crime in their community. So just by getting into this, lower level local position of power, we can make really big changes. A big fight that's happening by me right now in Illinois is a CO2 pipeline that wants to come through. And the company has said, we'll use eminent domain to take your land if you won't give it to us. Well, my county and now another small county, both of which are Republican controlled, have hired lawyers to oppose it, right? So we're seeing even Republicans in these cases, right? My county board is Republican controlled, but they were the first county in the state to hire lawyers and start going at this CO2 pipeline company and saying, no, you're not coming through Sangamon County. No, you're not, taking our land through eminent domain. So these are races that if we get in position, right, we show what we can do, and we actually have enough power on the local level to push some stuff through, as opposed to just getting bogged down and lost in the bureaucracy and the corruption of the federal government. Local parties can also serve as electoral coalition for issue movements and various political formations, right? Greens always talk about we want to be the electoral wing of progressive movements. It's far easier to gain that kind of coalition support of other organizations on the local level, right? And we saw that in 2020 with our Left Unity campaign. We had DSA chapters endorse us, but national DSA endorsement was never on the table. They were never going to buck from the at least tacit support from the Democratic Party, if not outright support, right? That was just never going to happen. Organizationally, that wasn't who DSA was, and that's not where they're at politically even today. But there were locals. There were locals here where I am in Central Illinois. There were locals in Utah, that were able that came, and there were a few others I can't remember, but they were the ones that endorsed, right? And that's the same is true, for local candidates I know in Allegheny County and Pittsburgh, right? You all get endorsements from your local DSA that would never ever happen on the national level. And by forming these relationships on the local level, just like by putting ourselves in local power, we can filter up that power. The same is true with these relationships with organizations like DSA, Sunrise. I don't think Extinction Rebellion gets into endorsements of political candidates, right? Or Sierra Club. These places, when they start endorsing us locally, when we start winning, when we start pushing through our agenda on the local level, now that local is going to pressure their state party, their state organization, right? Hey, these Greens are doing things if we give them the chance. And then that's when, once that relationship is established on the state level, now you've got a state level pushing the national, right? And I think Sierra Club's probably a great example because they are, for all intents and purposes, they are a Democratic front, right? They almost always back the Democratic Party. But on the local level, for instance, I know our local Sierra Club chapter lead very well, and I think they would endorse a local Green candidate, right? So there plays that role. And then one thing I realized as I'm reading this that I forgot, political parties give you longevity, right? Campaigns begin and campaigns end. And usually when campaigns end, most of the people that supported the campaign kind of disperse back out, right? They fade away. But with a local party, there's somewhere you can direct people that you meet through your campaigns. And that local party will last cycle after cycle after cycle. It'll be there. So it allows you to build power in a way that you can't if you're just running as an independent, right? If you run for office as an independent, you don't build any of that long-term power, right? You're not able to redirect it into an official organization that can last beyond your campaign. Here in Illinois, if I ran as an independent and I got, across the threshold to get ballot access as a Green, that means that whoever ran in my district after me would have that ballot access. As an independent, it's only for me, right? It doesn't extend to anyone else. Right? So why form a local party? Because they're what we need for long-term growth, right? Campaigns are like the boosters, right? The shots in the arm that get you going again, right? But the campaigns are your constant influx of new people, new ideas, new organizers. But if you don't send them into the party, it just kind of languishes. So I just talked about a whole bunch. I want to see if Garrett has anything where I click the next.
Yeah, I echo pretty much everything you said there. I kind of took some notes as you went of thoughts that I had. One of them to kind of keep going with your thought here about building a long-term organization. That to me is one of the big lessons of the Bernie Sanders campaigns. that we saw so much energy go into them in 2016 and 2020. And then where's that energy today? I mean, it evaporated like that as soon as the primary was over, not even the general election. And that's one of many reasons that it's problematic to work within the Democratic Party. However, that same sort of thing can affect Greens too, if we're focused only on campaigns and not on building long-term power. So, this is why if you've seen our previous 101s for Green Party 101, Eco-Socialist 101, we always insist that the Green Party is both an electoral organization and an activist organization. We have to be able to grow that long-term power. It's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen in one election cycle. But we can keep ourselves motivated by focusing on these issues, focusing on these ground level, local things, meeting our neighbors, building out that support and solidarity with our neighbors and with, aligned organizations, like Chris was saying, local DSA parties or chapters, I should say, but local parties too, that, we've cooperated with our local, Socialist Alternative and PSL on events, for example. There's various community organizations that do different things here that we work with. And that's where you start at the ground level. And once you build the trust, right, and the relationships and the solidarity with each other, you can run candidates that can really win. And, we've seen a big jump in that where, our candidates for local office, we've run in a couple of cycles now. And the first cycle, no one knew who we were, but the last cycle, they were getting over 30% of the vote. So we're moving that line, right? As more people get to know us, then they support us, and we grow the movement. So there's a lot of reason to make sure that all of our organizing goes into the long-term picture and not just getting caught up in election cycles. I also wanted to mention. Speaking of issues, I think one aspect that forming a local independent political party is so important compared to, nonprofits and these other organizations is because, aside from being captured by the Democratic Party very often, they tend to be very single issue focused. And so they end up becoming very siloed. And you even see organizations kind of duplicating and repeating work because they're all kind of off on their own doing, this one little very niche thing. And what the promise of a political party is that we have a whole political platform that can unite all of these issues together, and to see how all of these issues are related through that eco-socialist lens. We can see how all of these issues are actually, fundamental, what would you call it? Like symptoms of living in a capitalist system that's run by, centuries or built on centuries of, racism and sexism and patriarchy, all these concepts, right? And when we can unite them all together and realize that these are all actually part of the same struggle, that's when we can really build a big movement in solidarity. So you don't really see that so much in nonprofits, but you do see that in a political party that builds a platform and runs candidates that unite these issues. And lastly, I wanted to emphasize that it's so important to look at local offices, because that's where a lot of change happens, and a lot of change happens really easily. It, of course, it varies depending on the state. But in Pennsylvania, for example, outside of the major cities, like outside of Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, which are kind of the two oddballs, everywhere else in the state, you're talking about town councils or county councils, for that matter, of like 3 to 5 people. So if you want to affect like big policy, like in a county, you need to win like 2 seats in relatively small elections. Now, of course, recruiting candidates is part of the difficulty. We have to kind of expand out into those counties. And also, I'm not saying it's easy or happens overnight either. But I think we have to look at that long-term picture that starting from the local offices, we can really win those. And our national candidate database for the Green Party shows that we have a very high success rate when we run local candidates. they win something like half the time when we actually run for local office. Our issue is not that we can't win. Our issue is that we need way more candidates to run. We need to recruit those people, and to recruit the best candidates, you have to have active locals so that who's involved in your community, who's the best activist, who's a good public figure that can speak well. All of these things kind of come together, and they start at your local levels. And so don't write off how important local levels are. Congress gets all the media attention, but you can do so much at your city council, at your school board. In Pennsylvania, we actually elect the people that run the elections. So, if you just care about fair ballot access, like, you could be an elections judge in Pennsylvania relatively easily, and that's an important role. And you can get involved in various local boards. Again, it varies depending on the state, but there's environmental boards, library boards, whatever. Start at your local levels and make change. And I really want to emphasize how important that is, because we're actually seeing part of the reason we're seeing the rise of fascism from the extreme right now is they have had that strategy for a long time of taking over school boards and things. And that's why all of a sudden you're seeing, transphobia and like anti-CRT language and stuff. It's because these extremists get on school boards because no one was paying attention to them. Nobody was following them. Certainly not the Democrats. And so they've taken power, and they've been able to push through an agenda, even though they represent a very small radical minority. So we have to push back against that. And it also kind of shows our own path to build a green movement instead. So that's why we need a party. So we should move on, because I think we've spent a lot of time on that already. But having that good foundation, I think, is important.
Yeah. So starting off, right, I don't want to sugarcoat it. Depending on where you are, it can be very hard to start a local organization. We face a lot of repression as Greens and as independent socialists, right? And we face an already crowded, landscape. So some starting affirmations, right? No one needs permission to begin organizing in their communities. You can do it, right? All you've got to do is start. Good organizing is built first and foremost on trust in real relationships. Working class people rightfully don't trust politicians. Actions, not words, are what matter. And one problem I've seen in the Green Party the last few presidential cycles, and obviously this kind of comes with presidential, there's lots of reasons that we do run presidential campaigns, despite Garrett and I just spending a half an hour preaching about local. And some of it is because it very much does affect local, right? In terms of like ballot access. It's also a high visibility campaign that brings new people into the party. But during presidential campaigns, I often see, if everyone just voted green, we'd win. But that everyone they're talking about doesn't have a reason to trust us, right? We have not built relationships. We haven't shown up for their fights. We're not involved in their struggles. And the expectation that they would just vote for us because our platform is good is unrealistic. And it's not a good organizing strategy, right? Platforms are words. And in politics, especially, words ain't shit, right? How many times has a Democrat knocked on your door with campaign promises that never happened, right? We just saw Roe versus Wade knocked down by the Supreme Court. Barack Obama ran promising to protect it federally. He had full control of both houses. And when he actually got into power, despite the campaign promise to federally protect the right to access to abortion, he said it wasn't a priority. He focused elsewhere, right? So the working class is correct in their mistrust, and we are not immune to it, nor should we be. So we really have to build those relationships, and to build those relationships, we've got to build them on the local level first. Don't let yourself get overwhelmed, right? We're living in if you watched our last eco-socialism one, you heard us talk a lot about kind of the totality of capitalism, right? It's everywhere. It's got its fingers in everything. And because of that, there's so much we need to do, even on the local level, right? That if you try to pick up every little thing, if you try to address every single issue, you're not going to have the capacity to organize seriously on any of them, right? It very much is the jack of all trades, master of none. So don't be afraid to start with one or two things. And in fact, you should only start with a few things. You shouldn't start with 20 things you want to do, because you're going to divide yourself 20 ways and you're not going to be able to accomplish them. Make sure you do your prep work and planning. If you're always shooting from the hip, it's hard to be effective, right? Decide on measures and metrics to determine whether an action was successful or not. And that doesn't mean you won, but it could mean we brought out more people than we ever had, right? We added this many volunteers, we added this many organizers, we established this relationship with this organization or this influential person, right? But it's hard to do that if you're just constantly shooting from the hip and responding to everything because you feel like you have to. There's an organization in Carbondale, Illinois, in Southern Illinois, called Carbondale Spring. And when they formed, they spent 6 months to a year doing research, studying their community, reaching out and starting to build those relationships. And then all of a sudden, someone wanted to build a solar plant in one of the neighborhoods in their community. And renewable energy was one of their primary goals, but they were connected in with the neighborhood. And they realized this working class neighborhood is going to get bulldozed, and these people are going to get pushed out for a solar, for a solar operation. And they didn't want it in their neighborhood, right? And so they helped defeat it. Even though it was one of their primary goals, the neighborhood didn't want it. They came together, they helped defeat it, and all of a sudden they've got some traction. And then a few months later, Trump was coming to town, and they put out a proposal before the city council declaring Carbondale to be a welcoming city, welcoming city, and that Trump wasn't welcome. His rhetoric and his hatred wasn't welcome. Well, the city council tabled it and kind of hid from it. They didn't want to take a political stance on Trump. So Carbondale Spring and their members declared the city council to have abdicated their duty. They walked outside in front of City Hall, they held a rally, and the public passed the proposal. Now, did it hold any real, power? No, but it was a huge statement. And now there was somebody that the city had to work with. And so fast forward a year or two, and the city's giving them land for urban gardens in their parks. The city is putting money away to fund for renewable energy. The city is actively looking at their policing habits, right? But they had to build that relationship first, and they had to sit down and really think about what they were going to do, right? And that's really important. And we'll get into that in a minute, some of the kind of initial thoughts. There's no one method to organize. Learn and adapt ideas from others. Do what makes sense for you, your community, and your goals, right? We said at the very beginning of this, there's not a lot of resources out there for independent socialist organizing. Most resources push you right back into the not-for-profit industrial complex, push you right back into the Democratic Party, right? So there's not a lot out there. So you've got to be able to take it and adapt what you can, right? You've got to be able to look at Foster, and you've got to be able to look at Alinsky, and you've got to be able to, both twist them, alter them to get them to fit with your local organizing and your local times. And then, as I just said, there's very few resources, so we've got to be adaptable with this. I want to repeat again, you can't do it alone, right? The first thing you need to do, right? So if Garrett and I are like, hey, let's start a Green Party. Literally, after those initial conversations, the first thing we need to do is sit down with each other and say, who's going to be our initial organizing group? Without this core group, you're not going to be able to achieve all of our goals, right? Garrett and I cannot do it all alone. And Garrett and I are also, not to, play identity politics, but not the most diverse of groups when it's just the two of us, right? So what people are in your immediate circle that can help you form this organization? What friends do you have? What family do you have? What coworkers do you have that share your political views to one extent or the other? And these are the people you can pull in for your initial group, right? While I'm saying you can't do it alone, especially on the local level, you'll be shocked what 6 to 12 people can get done, because it's a lot. If you have 6 to 12 serious organizers, you can do some real good work, right? It doesn't take a lot, but it takes more than one or two. So you want to find that first group. And so the first thing you want to do is the low-hanging fruit, right? What socialists do I know that might want to be involved in this, right? After you've done that, contact your state party. If you're not with the Green Party, if you're organizing the Socialist Alternative, contact Socialist Alternative, right? Whatever parent organization you have, but if in the Green Party, contact your state party. The state party should be able to give you contacts in your area, guidance on how to become official, right? And depending on the state, various resources. If you become a chapter in Illinois, you'll get an email from me, the secretary, saying, here's what you need to do to have us set up a website for you. Here's the Zoom account that you can use. Here's the live stream account that you can use. Here's the database list, and here's trainings on how to use it, how to send emails, how to run surveys, that kind of thing. So we'll, in addition to giving you your initial contact list, we'll give you as many resources as we can to help you. If your state party doesn't have much, which some places it doesn't, contact the national party, right? They will at least have contact lists that you can try to squeeze out of them. And the national party does have, kind of a cache of resources to help you go organize. And then lastly, contact us at the Green Socialist Organizing Project, right? Whether it be just helping you, we've got our own lists from the Howie campaign, right? If you get a list from the national campaign, you don't need one from the Howie campaign. We shared with each other, so you'll have it already. But if you're running, into walls when you're trying to get at contact lists and no one's helping you, send us a message at the Green Socialist Organizing Project at greensocialist.net, and we can help you out with contact lists. We can help you out with resources like these videos. We can, potentially help connect you with, a mentor to help you figure out how to do this stuff and form your local chapter. So the first thing you want to do, right, is make it so it's not just you. Make it, to build that initial organizing group off the low-hanging fruit of people you already know. And then the second kind of level of that low-hanging fruit is people the party already knows, right? To get that larger list.
Yeah, to kind of concretize that a little bit real quick. Like, for example, in Pennsylvania, if I'm forming a new county chapter here, you would contact our state party that has information on how to create a local and how to affiliate with us, how to be identified as an official chapter of the Green Party. Because since we're recognized under state law as the Green Party, we have to inform the state, which are the official local chapters so that people don't impersonate us, right? So there's a certain process, yeah. So there's a certain process you have to go through where you formally adopt some bylaws that are very simple, and we give you a template, but some very basic bylaws that just kind of outline how your chapter runs, how decisions are made, for example, and then you also need to create like a bank account and basic stuff, right, to start raising money and things. And you really should have that group of like 10 people like Chris is talking about, but even for kind of legal reasons, you need at least a couple, because you need someone to be like a chair and a treasurer and a secretary and all, not just for party purposes, but because like that's legally what you have to do to form a political action committee that can raise money, which is what we do in Pennsylvania for to create a county local. The laws vary depending on the state. But that's roughly what you can expect, right? You need at least a handful of people to get started so that you can have like a chair and a secretary and a treasurer. Your state party can get you a list of registered voters that live in your district or your county. In most states, there's a few states that are strange, and you don't register by party. But Illinois is one of them. but your state party will still have lists of people that have reached out to the party, right, and have been involved in past activities or contributed $5 at some point, whatever it is. So the party can get you a list of people and help you through the basic paperwork to get involved. But that I think comes a little bit down the line too, once you do all the next slide, which is like all the power mapping and kind of setting your initial purpose. So I'll throw it back to Chris for that.
Yeah, so we've done our initial, right? Who do I know that are the obvious people, right? Who are the my fellow socialists in my community, right? Who are my fellow environmentalists? Who's the person I know that's really into Medicare for all, right? The Green Party has, and it's something that we always need to keep in mind, because we're often portrayed as these crazy radicals, but green policies are majoritarian, right? Oh, what's the number? I believe over 60% support Medicare for all, including the majority of Republicans, right? 90+% of Democrats support it, even though their leadership doesn't and won't pass it, right? The Green New Deal in 2020 had 62% support, right? These aren't out there extremist ideas, they're popular ideas, right? So we need to remember that, and we need to, kind of be the positive voice for them, because it's really lacking, or it's sucked up into the not-for-profits. So once we've done, that initial outreach of the people we obviously already know, we go to the next level, and that's power mapping, right? Who do I know, right? Who do I know at work? Who do I know in my community as my neighbors? Who do I know through friendships? Who do I know through school? Who do I know through various community organizations, whether that's the church or a local peace organization or whatever? But start actually writing it down, right? Start actually mapping out your network, by consciously thinking about who you know, who they know, and the networks of our community. We can develop a clear focus, both in terms of who we want to be talking to and where potential paths to change exist, right? So the basics are, like I said, who do you know? Who do they know? And try to split them off into, geography, issues, policy, relationship type, all that kind of stuff. Another thing to consider is who holds influence. It's not always power, right? That's not always a position of power, but who holds influence in your community? Who do they influence? An example I always use of this is the block mob, right? When I was a community organizer, knocking doors in the working class communities of my town, we would often run into, the precinct committee person, the official holder of power in the neighborhood, and learn that that person held no power, right? But what we did find was the woman down the block that everybody came to her barbecue, right? The woman down the block that when she put out a call for something, everybody showed up. She had no official power, but she was the de facto leader of the neighborhood, right? Identify that person, because we're as independent socialists and as Greens, we don't have a lot of money. We don't always have a lot of resources, right? So we need to be efficient. And in that case, knowing that person, knowing if I want to work in JC Park, I need to call this person and she'll turn out 20 people for me, right? Rather than knocking on those 20 doors and then have to go, I don't know, but her weight will get them there, right? Consider some kind of ranking system when you're doing this. Red if someone disagrees with you, green if they agree with you. Kind of help you visualize it. Otherwise, it's just going to be a giant list of names with no context, right? And note when connections can be made with decision makers or influencers or potential allies. And then you can reverse this, right? I want to talk to my city councilor. I don't know them personally, but I know this person knows them, and then that they're friends with their sister, and now I'm there, right? So you can reverse this. And you can also use this for issue campaigns, though slightly differently. There's some links, and the link to this slide shows in the very top of the chat from when we started. So you can go and you can click those links. But the NEA, the National Education Association, and Move to Amend, I put links for them for how to do issue-oriented mapping, right? And that has a lot more to do with tracking power. When you're doing the issue, you want to implement a change, so you track that power. But when we're doing this initial power mapping, it's more about mapping your networks in the community, right? Because what that's going to tell you is where to start. We don't want to be airdropping in. We don't want to be riding in on a white horse into someone's neighborhood and telling them that we're there to save them, right? We want to be invited into these neighborhoods. We want to be entering these neighborhoods based on existing relationships. because then people will listen to us and we're not just another politician, which we don't want to be. And that kind of ties into, this will also, doing that power mapping will also help you find your space. Often it can be really hard for Greens to find a space to operate and expand within the political ecosystem. We face open repression, in states like Illinois. The shocking number that I always use is if you want to run for U.S. House as a Republican or a Democrat, you have to collect between 700 and 800 signatures. If you want to run as a Green, you've got to collect more than 15,000 in 90 days from within a single congressional district, and you've got to double it. So for me to run for Congress, I have to collect 30,000 signatures in 90 days from within a largely rural congressional district. That's a level of lift that's almost impossible, right? Unless you have a strong organization. That's the only way you're getting something like that done. And that repression can make it really hard for us to find our space, right? Because we're literally being beaten with a stick as we try to build. And the people that do have power are literally using their power to stop us from growing. Another problem we often have is in larger cities with established leftist organizations, even if they're small today, right? Greens often have a hard time getting a foothold. Historically, Greens have been more of kind of social democratic, right? New Deal type policies. And it wasn't until 2016 that the Green Party of the United States became officially eco-socialist. Now, there's been socialist Greens since day one, right? It's been one of the primary movements, primary demographics within the party. But historically, we didn't have a strong socialist identity. So that means when you go into a place like Chicago or a place like Seattle, right, you've got the left flank of the Democratic Party. And then in Seattle, you've got Socialist Alternative and Gassama Shazwat, right? That's a very tiny, tiny hole that Greens, if they're just another, social democratic org, to try to thread, right? Because oftentimes, in big cities, you'll find your moderate Greens will find themselves to the right of the, DSA types, of the left flank of DSA, right? And then sandwiched in between something like Answer in Chicago, which historically, has come out of the Socialist Party and has had huge success in anti-war protests in Chicago. Right now they're very small, but in the history, that history still lingers. So it's really hard for Greens. It's been really hard in the past for Greens in Chicago to get a foothold if they weren't, having an explicit politics. The landscape, as we said earlier, is also filled with not-for-profit issue-oriented groups. Usually they're officially nonpartisan, but these organizations suck a lot of energy and money out of the air. They redirect people on issues into the Democratic Party, whether officially or not, right? Sunrise, Sierra Club, these are all nonpartisan organizations, but they are very much partisan organizations when you look at their endorsements and their activities. So to overcome these barriers to building a green socialist movement, it's really important that we're thinking about who our prospective base is and formulating strategies to help us orient our work, right? We don't have the money and the resources and the access to just go out there and, the Democratic Party will just throw money at something until they get us foothold, right? We don't have that money. If Sunrise wants to come into your community, although I think Sunrise is in a little financial trouble right now, but if post 2020 Sunrise wanted to come into your community, they could literally pay for organizers to move into your town and just create a foothold themselves. And as Greens and independent socialists, we don't have that. So we need to be efficient and strategic in our work, right? So we've got to think about, who do we know? Where is there an opening, right? If you're really into, ranked choice voting, that's great. But if there's already multiple organizations working on it, it's going to be really hard for you to, differentiate yourself and grow. Whereas if you find an issue where no one's talking about it, that's an opportunity, right, that we can jump into. Garrett?
Yeah, I agree there with like I said in the previous slides, I think that a lot of issues, or a lot of organizations and nonprofits tend to get focused on particular issues, and then sometimes to the point where they don't feel like someone is being, let's say, radical enough, right? So you see these splinter groups where you might have more than one group that's focusing on a particular issue. So it's very hard to get attention starting up talking about an issue that's already being talked about by a bunch of other organizations. Instead, it might be better to support them in solidarity, but make your waves as a new Green Party local by tackling something that isn't being tackled. And what that is depends a lot on where you are, what's going on in your particular town or county or region. It varies a lot what the priorities are, but I can guarantee that everywhere has something that needs to be tackled because just of all of the systemic issues that we're facing under capitalism. We haven't defeated poverty yet. Fascism is rising. We haven't defeated fascism yet. We haven't gotten Medicare for all, right? We haven't gotten healthcare as a human right yet. We haven't done a Green New Deal yet. We haven't done serious climate change action yet. All of these things need to be done. And, there's probably at least one of those that you can have some sort of direct impact on in your local community that is currently not being talked about by anyone else. And, one way that we've grown our local Pittsburgh chapter is dealing with the fact that Southwest Pennsylvania is targeted by both Republicans and Democrats right now as kind of a new fossil fuel petrochemical hub. They want to build plastics factories here called a cracker plant, ethane cracker. They want to build petrochemicals here. They want to feed those petrochemicals with natural gas that they mine with fracking. So there's all kinds of plans for fracking and pipelines and plastics and all this stuff for this region, and it's a bipartisan issue. And so you see both of the major, the duopoly parties behind this, and even all of the nonprofits kind of lining up, where even the environmental nonprofits in this area are kind of like, well, they're going to do fracking, but we're going to try to limit the methane to be a little bit less than what it is right now. And so there's like no one who's taking a stand for all of the communities, which very often are, poor working class, and especially, Black and brown communities that are on the front lines of this stuff that are just getting bulldozed by these pipelines, and no one is speaking for them. So when the Green Party comes out and says, we care, we're speaking, we're confronting this issue, both as a social justice issue, an economic justice issue, a climate justice issue, that starts to get a lot of attention. That starts to change people's attitudes. And, the shift is slow, but I'm starting to see this shift here where a few years ago, all of the organizations were supporting Democrats, saying that they were climate champions while they were doing pipelines. And now you're starting to see these organizations come out with a little bit stronger words each time, and asking a little bit more about, like, tell us more about what your climate policy is, because you're being kind of vague there. And so, you can see that momentum starting to build. So, pick something like that no one is addressing, and use that to build your foothold. And, as you can do that, you can connect it to other struggles. Like I said, we're connecting pipelines to, economic justice with the working class, with racial justice, environmental justice. All of these issues are together. And, that's, again, what a political party is for, that we unite these issues into a political platform in solidarity where we can support each other and make it happen.
Yeah, and I'd say I'm seeing similar kind of shifts out of, as Garrett is, where the collaborationist tactics with corporate Democrats that, progressive interest groups and issue organizations and not-for-profits have been taking has seen them stabbed in the back time and time and time again. Right? They go and they say, well, we're at the table, so we have some power. And then they see themselves pushed out of the table, and nothing on the paper at the end represents what they wanted. Right? When we had our big fracking fight in Illinois years ago, it was the governor was a Democrat, and there were super majorities in both the House and the Senate for the Democrats, right? So the Democrats went behind closed doors with the industry, joined by the Sierra Club, joined by the Illinois Environmental Council. And while they were back there making a deal to legalize fracking in Illinois, Greens and other environmentalists were getting arrested sitting in outside the governor's office where they were, right? They were hiding behind those closed doors, and they came out and they make a big deal about Illinois has the most restrictive fracking law in the country. Well, what they didn't tell you was that they didn't address the number of inspectors that we have. At the time, Illinois had 7 oil well inspectors for the entire state. 7. And thousands of wells. We couldn't inspect the wells we had, let alone actually, enforce new regulations on fracking. And in the end, fracking didn't happen in Illinois. It just hasn't been economical, right? But those not-for-profits were 100%, stabbing us in the back for their little bit of power. So I've seen that shift too, and it creates an opening for us, right? It creates an opening for us to offer that different path, whereas they're just pulling people in. So when you're having this conversation about finding your space, there's a few things you can think of. What are you going to organize around? Turf, geography, right? Issues, identity, workplaces. And this isn't a question that you answer one time and continue on, right? This is a constant question that we should be asking ourselves. Michael Shen had asked, what about local parties serving as shadow government, building dual power, organizing the founding of co-ops, and building economic power that way? Absolutely, right? So in the beginning, and this kind of strategic thing should be something you're doing regularly. We're talking about it right at the beginning. But when you do when you're having these conversations, those are the kinds of things you should be asking, right? If you don't think you're ready to run a candidate that can actually challenge and, have a serious campaign, then you can dive into issue organizing, right? If you're like me, I live in a state capital. And a few months ago, my brother-in-law asked me to help organize the food service place that he was working in. So I reached out to union folks I knew. Again, this is a state capital. Every single major union is here, right? They have offices here. They've got staff here. And what I was told by the, former president of our Trades and Labor Council was that no one in town was organizing service workers. Not one of them. The staff that they have in town is for lobbying, right? It's not for doing the work. So if you've got members who are, working in the service industry and want to dive into this, absolutely, right? I'll kind of warn that service industry organizing is huge, right? And just like everything else we've talked about, it's going to be, you and your ragtag group against a multinational, multi-million or billion-dollar corporation, right? But these are the questions you need to ask yourself, right? As you're starting to organize and as you continue to organize, right? Are we organizing in a specific geographic area, right? For instance, in my neighborhood, I probably have the most active neighborhood association in town. There's not that much space for me to generally just start organizing on city issues in my neighborhood because there's already a spokesperson in my neighborhood. There's already an official outlet in my neighborhood. On the other hand, I know from participating that my neighborhood association very much excludes renters. So there's a big opening for a tenants union in my neighborhood, right? And that we can, and that's getting into, a turf and an issue. So there's crossover. This is intersectional, right? So think about your community, do research, right? Look into, your city's budget and see where you can start raising things, see where there's money that you might be able to have redirected. And then another important, when you're doing this kind of thinking, I really like this structure that Lee Staples had where you ask who wants what from whom and how can it be accomplished, right? Because if we want to change, if we're coming up with an issue to organize, it's because we want to change things, right? So who are we, right? Who's our membership, our structure, our leadership as staff? How, and democratically come to the decision that what do you want? right? What do we want? What do we want to change? And then you need to think about it. And this is where, going back into, reverse power mapping and issues oriented power mapping comes into play, right? If you're organizing heavily, you could very well be power mapping pretty regularly, right? Not just the kind of, who do you know that we talked about, but then later doing issues oriented mapping, where how do we get to the city councilors that we need to move, right? How do we get who lives in their neighborhoods, right? Because me emailing a city council person from across the city from me, they have no reason to care about what I have to say. I'm not their constituent, right? But what 12 people in the neighborhood that do care about this do I know? What 20 people, what 30 people, what 100 people? And they can then start emailing. And another thing about local offices too, right? You show, in my town of 100,000, you show up with a dozen people to a city council meeting, you're now the loudest voice in the room, right? You show up with 100, they can't fit you. And they're going to have to deal with that, right? How do they vote against something when the room's full of people and it's standing room only in the hall yelling for them not to do it? Now they have to consider their constituencies. Now they have to consider the voice of the people. But if you're not showing up, right? If you're not organizing people there, they don't know. If you're not flooding their inboxes before the meeting, they don't know. So who wants what from whom and how can it be accomplished is a great way to think about, how to start actual organizing. After you've kind of had the larger brainstorm of, turf, issue, identity, and workplace organizing conversations. So this is the initial early work, right, that core group's going to do. Having these conversations and democratically coming to these, positions and decisions.
Yeah, Chris, I wanted to throw in real quick there. One strategy that I think folks in Pittsburgh were following is that these organizing questions should be dynamic. They should be adaptable to what's going on and how the conditions are changing. Maybe suddenly a new issue comes up and it's very important and you might want to switch tactics. It could be that you tried some tactic and it worked really well and maybe you want to do that more. Maybe it didn't work as well as you thought and you want to change it. So you should always ask as part of this as you go if things can change. And related to that is that also don't feel very stuck either, that when you start this, you can change it as you go. Don't feel like you have to be stuck in any one particular organizing space or issue or whatever it is when you get started. Just pick something to get started with. And what we saw in Pittsburgh, for example, was in terms of turf, in terms of geography, the city and the county is very big and very dense in the inner city, and then the rest of the county is actually fairly spread out among. Rural would be a little bit too extreme, but what would you call it? Like suburban, exurban, something like that. Communities. So there's actually a lot of variation in the communities just in my county. So what we did was we focused on some issues. We focused on things like fracking to get more to get more attention to that issue and to our organization, to the Green Party. And as more people came in looking to learn more about that situation, we could track members and we could group and we could say, hey, we saw that like 10 of you seem like you live in the same neighborhood. How about you create a smaller neighborhood committee and you could start looking at candidates in your neighborhood that will fit your issues that may not fit the rest of the county, so that as a county level local party, we're looking at issues together, but then we kind of have sub-locals, right? These neighborhood groups that can do things like recruit candidates and look a little bit more seriously at the kind of tactics that Chris is talking about, that you can flood that particular town's town hall meeting with residents of that community, now that you have a base of like 10 people there. But we got those 10 people together initially by starting as an issue organizing group. So, that's something to consider, that I think the turf organizing in terms of a local party is important for running candidates, because obviously you have a certain district, a geographic district you need to run in. But before you get there, you might want to start with something like an issue or a workplace organizing effort to start to get to know people before you consider those campaigns.
Yeah, the adaptability thing, it's absolutely key, right? The thing that pops to my mind is that my local was going to organize an event around the March for Medicare for All. And so, we were plotting for it, we were getting ready for it, and then Roe happened. And I'm sure that my community is not alone when I say that all political action got sucked completely into Roe. Right, it was the elephant in the room, and it took over, and there really was no space for any other organizing right there for a minute while people were, responding to the falling of Roe. So we had to pivot, right? We actually dropped the event because even the other organizations that we were working with were like, we can't focus on this right now, right? We're organizing, and most of them were Democratic Party oriented, right? So they very much jumped into the Roe and voting is the solution. So you've got to be able to pivot, and a lot of times it's not in your control, kind of what makes you pivot. So we've got to be very, very adaptable. So another thing with finding your space is, you need to, once you figured out what you're going to work on, whether it be an issue or a geographic thing or whatever, then you've got to start thinking about the broader landscape, right? What other organizations have overlap with the organization's goals and values in this organizing? These could go two ways, right? It could be a potential competitor, or it could be a natural ally, right? So, and electoralism is obviously the main place where we're going to run into competitors, right? Especially as like a Green in Illinois, a lot of times Democrats literally don't want us to exist. They have politically, repressed us off the ballot. And when campaign season gets in, I have had Democrats openly tell me that they support the Democratic Party doing everything it can to destroy the Green Party and every other left party because it takes their votes, right? So that's a competition situation. Now that same person may be an ally on an issue, right? So we've got to think about these things. Are there areas, whether geographic or issue oriented, where there's a lack of organizing activity? What makes your organization unique and best suited for organizing in a given area or issue? And what are some threats to your organization's success and growth? What are some barriers that you have to overcome? Early on in the process of forming a local, I think it's really, or any organization, right? I'm on the board of a arts not-for-profit, and I'm trying to find a way to get everyone to sit down in a room for hours at a time and do a SWOT. Right. And so SWOT, SWOT analysis is a way of thinking about your organization or thinking about a campaign, issue or political, and doing an analysis of what are our strengths, what are our weaknesses, what are our opportunities, what are our threats. And this can help you figure out, ahead of time, what you need to navigate around, right? We talked about shooting from the hip, making you inefficient and ineffective. This is an example of how to avoid it, right? If you've done the research and you say, we're going to have to collect 30,000 signatures in 90 days to run for Congress, you can probably take that off your plate right away, right? Rather than getting somebody new coming in and they really want to run for Congress and they drag you into this, absolutely devastating petition drive that is almost doomed to fail from the beginning. And now everyone's dejected, right? In my local, unless someone has a really compelling reason for us to change our mind, we're not running for Congress, right? The level of repression, the level of threats that we have in that area are just too big to overcome without building ourselves much more, as an organization. So it's really important to think about these things. Otherwise, we're going to be going down dead ends. Otherwise, we're going to be going right into a brick wall that we might have known was there had we taken a second, right?
Yep.
I think it's important to say, don't dive too deep. Right? Don't not organize because you're trying to do a SWOT, but also don't just run out like a chicken with its head cut off organizing, right? Don't blind organize. We've got to think about these things. And when we have these conversations about things like potential allied organizations, that gives us, buttresses for our work if we can form those alliances. Thinking about like ranked choice voting and the group Fair Vote. In Illinois, we don't really have a good relationship with Fair Vote as Greens because they don't support ballot access equity. They call it a secondary issue. Well, ranked choice voting passing in Illinois means that you're going to get to vote, you're going to get to rank a Republican and a Democrat, and that's it, right? I've talked a lot about how many petitions we have to collect, and if we're not on the ballot, we can't be ranked, right? So when we engage with rank the vote, what we're actually doing most of the time is trying to move them, right? They're a potential ally, but we're spending our time working with them on talking to them about ranked choice voting, not talking about how to pass what they want in Illinois, but talking about how what they want isn't democracy. And they need to move, right? And if we move them, now we've got a very powerful ally with national connections on the issue, right? And if you're somewhere like Colorado, you need 1,000 registered Greens, and you're on the ballot. Just ranked choice voting is a boon to them, right? Because they're already on the ballot. Pennsylvania is kind of in the middle, right? You got to collect about 5,000 signatures to get on the ballot. So it's a lift, but it's also a doable lift. You all just did it this year. So having these conversations, thinking about when you're working with other people, other organizations, what that relationship actually is, and how to move it to where you want it to be. Because when Rank the Vote first came to us in Illinois, or Fair Vote, sorry, not Rank the Vote. Yeah, Fair Vote, when they're both Rank the Vote's a national thing, but when Fair Vote first came to us, they thought these guys are our allies. And their member basically got yelled out of the room, right? Because they didn't realize, they had no clue about ballot access. They never looked into it. So they didn't do this research, and they thought they were coming to a natural ally and found a lot of criticism and critique, right? So we've got to be able to make sure we're not doing that. We're not wasting that time, and we're coming into our conversations with the proper orientation so we can have successes.
Yeah, and see, that's a good example, I think, of setting really winnable goals, and that to me is part of the whole process of this. That when you're selecting your first issue and you're doing this power map and you're reaching people, you want to select something that you can win with your small team and relatively quickly, because it's the snowball effect that once you get a win, no matter how small it is, it could be like kind of the dumbest thing in the world, but if it's something you can claim as a victory, people get excited about that, and then they'll join and they'll want to know, how can we build on this? How can we do something more? And then you ratchet it up. You say, well, okay, the first time we got this little thing, how about next time we do something bigger? And I think the duopoly's message through media is all on getting butts in seats. It's all in getting people elected, especially to Congress. Like we were saying earlier, they almost never talk about local offices. I can say that there has literally been in my county cases where seats have gone no one at all was running. No Republican, no Democrat, no nothing. They literally had to appoint someone later because no one ran for it. No one was paying attention. So if we can find those local things and get involved, that's good, but it's also not just elections, it's these issue campaigns. And sometimes moving a big organization is actually a really big win for us, because they're getting that message out there that's helping us. And if you're having trouble picking what is kind of the small winnable goal to start with, that's another reason to reach out to your state party or to the national party, because there are a lot of really great organizers in the Green Party that have been doing this for decades at this point. And unfortunately, sometimes the work isn't always known nationally, but not just because of media suppression and things, but also because Greens also tend to be involved in these other organizations. I'm going to say Fair Vote because I can't think of one offhand, but let's just say Greens involved in Fair Vote. And so when things like that happen, when they switch their policy and they start advocating these things, sometimes that switch was generated by Greens on the ground in those organizations. They pushed the Overton window to the left, so to speak, right? They pushed that conversation, and maybe people don't realize that it was the Greens pushing it, but it did happen, and that had a very important effect on the public debate and, of course, public policy down the line. So those are all very important wins, even if even if the media doesn't necessarily talk about it. We know it's a win, and we should use that to put our message out to others and say, look at this win that we're doing, that Democrats are not doing, the Republicans are not doing, that all these organizations are not doing. The organizations were making compromises with the industry, and we were the ones pushing them. You want to join us and help us push harder next time.
Yeah. So in addition to thinking about, strategically about what you want to be talking about, right? It's really important when we talk about who we want to be talking to, right? Who is our likely base? We should have conscious discussions and strategy surrounding who we want to be talking to. Ask questions like, what do I care about? And how does that impact my community, right? People do a lot better work if they're organizing around something that they care about, that they're passionate about, as opposed to just doing what everyone else is doing, right? So what do we care about? What are we passionate about? And then think about, how does that impact my community? Who in my community does that most impact, right? And how do we organize for change? Who are we in terms of what community does our core group represent? As I said earlier, it's important. We don't want to be on a white horse, right? Working class communities have seen more than enough politicians on white horses come in promising to save them and then abandoning them, right? Start it where you are and grow outwards. Strategize on how to become more inclusive. People often ask, where should I start? And we'll talk about relational organizing or deep canvassing later when we actually get to starting. But, people will often ask, where should I start? And my answer is always your neighbor, and then the neighbor on the other side of them, and then the neighbor on the other side of them, right? You start out from where you live and you start making concentric circles, right? You start talking to people directly around you, the people that you interact with, the people who face the same struggles that you do, the people that have the same environmental effects because they live right next to you that you do, right? If I wanted to start organizing about getting rid of the train that's behind my house, which is supposed to happen. We're 10 years in, and there's probably another 10 years before the train's gone. But you start organizing with the other people who are pissed off about the train, right? They're pissed off that it's going through, at midnight, honking its horn constantly, and, that are pissed off that people are dying on the tracks, and things like that. So you start with who's immediate to you when you're doing that work. Who do we want to be represented in the organization, right? Oftentimes political groups act more as advocates for other people than voices for their own members, right? And we don't want to fall into that. We don't want to fall into savior complex stuff like that. If your membership is lacking in the people that you want to advocate for, how can you build relationships and expand your reach outside the people in the room, right? Greens often have a problem with the first people in the room. The people that founded the party have camped in positions, and often, and not always, right? There's some amazing party founders. I work with Howie on almost a daily basis, and he's been organizing for 35 plus years for this party and doing the work, right? But other places, they've been sitting and they've been occupying space, and they've often been blocking evolution and change and organizing, right? So in that situation, the solution is to organize around them, right? Bring more people into the room. And one thing that I think we really need to think about is, as socialist organizers, who has material interest in change, right? Someone who has a material interest in seeing a change is going to fight tooth and nail for it, right? Someone for whom it's an academic or ideological point can easily reach a point where they walk away because the challenges or the risks are too much, right? It's a good example is healthcare, right? An uninsured person is going to fight tooth and nail. They're going to throw down for universal health care, right? Because it means they get fucking health coverage, right? It means that they actually get to see a doctor potentially, right? But if you just think it's a good idea, the major unions are a perfect example of this, right? Many of them oppose universal health care because of the sweet healthcare deals they've gotten in their negotiations for their people, right? When push comes to shove, they don't support universal health care because they think it might hurt their members. So they back out and they don't support, right? As opposed to that uninsured person working, in the food service. This is ride or die for them, right? They got to do it. They got to have this change, or they're going to continue to suffer from lack of health care. They're going to die younger because that's what we do when we don't have health care, right? So I as socialists, I'm a much more of a Marxist leaning, anarchist and socialist, but we have to focus in on who has an interest in material change, right? Another big debate in the Green Party is dues. And what I've found personally is that the working class people who have material interest in change will make dues happen, right? They'll find a way to scrounge the $12 to pay the minimum low income dues that we have in Illinois, right? They'll find a way to scrape out the $10 a month to pay normal dues because they believe in the mission, they believe in the change we want. Who fights dues, in my experience, usually is the middle class, right? The people who can afford it, but they often advocate for those who can't, while those who can't are making it work, right? That material interest is so key to actually having the follow through, to overcome challenges, right? Because if you don't have that material interest, there's a line that you won't cross, right? And we've got to deal with that. So yeah, I have said it multiple times, we don't need people on a white horse. What we should be striving for is to build bottom-up democratic organizations that are made up of the community, not speaking for them, right? Of, not for, I think is a very important, model when you're qualifying the lead and who should you be talking to.
Yeah, actually, on that point, which I think kind of advances us to our next slide anyway, when we're talking about this idea of made up of the community and not for them, what we're really talking about is teaching others to be their own organizers and to go on and to keep building the organization that they want to see. So I think those of us that are starting local parties, starting these organizations, we have to have an organizer mindset, which one way to define that is we should really be looking to put ourselves out of a job, so to speak. We're not there to speak for people. We're there to help empower them. We're there to help share the tools and the infrastructure and knowledge we've gained over time so that they can actually create the democratic processes that they want, that serve their community and that make the decisions and all that they need for their community, because every community is different. It's the people who live there in that community who know what they need. That's what Chris is talking about, right? You ask a working class person what the working class needs. So that's an important mindset here, I think, to have, that we're not going in there to save people. We're trying to build a movement here that's going to work for everyone, and the way that it works for everyone is by empowering each of those communities to act on their own, to make their own decisions, to have self-determination, yet all of us linked together in solidarity.
Yeah, and when Garrett was talking earlier, about the subdivisions of the larger geographic area in Allegheny County, right? You got the county, and then you've got all of the small towns within the non-Pittsburgh areas of the county, and then you've got Pittsburgh, and then Pittsburgh is divided into its own neighborhoods, right? An important thing about this, empowerment is that what environmental crisis looks like, what, a lack of public works investment looks like, what a lack of affordable housing looks like, what a lack of access to healthcare looks different and manifests slightly differently in each of these neighborhoods, right? So when when I march across town and go into another neighborhood demanding the changes that I need in my neighborhood, I very well could not be representing even the problems that they have, right? And when you do that, you've shown yourself to be very out of touch and very untrustworthy, right? Which, going all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, trusting relationships are the key, right, to doing this work. So it's really important that we, we're the of, not for, and that we're empowering people, not speaking on behalf of them.
If I could throw in a quick example, you were talking about the geographic distinctions. I live in a suburb just outside of Pittsburgh, so I don't live in the city itself. So it's very interesting to see the different kinds of conversations that happen when you get the different constituencies, the different neighborhoods together to talk. Because the talk for people that live in Pittsburgh is very different from the people that live in my suburb versus other suburbs. So what happens in Pittsburgh, for example, is things like public transit are very important there because we're talking about big apartment buildings, lots of cars because it's the dense, busy part of the city. So, it makes much more sense to bike, to walk, to ride public transit. But the public transit is not very reliable outside the city. So when they talk public transit, if they were to come to my town and say, all this stuff about public transit, the people here would say, well, that sounds great, but like, we don't actually have any bus lanes here. We don't have any trains here. So if we did those things, we would need much more investment for those things, because our town is not prepared for that sort of thing. But my suburb is actually walkable. We have a small walkable downtown where people can go to, a little grocery store and things like that. But there's lots of towns around me that they don't have anything like that. There's, there's some little small highway that goes off into the forest, right? And you just see houses along the way, and it's not walkable. So, for example, when you're planning campaigns, the people in Pittsburgh, they'll say, let's go door to door and let's go talk to everybody. You could do that in some communities, but maybe not others, because you can't even literally walk without putting your personal safety at risk because you're walking down the highway, So these are all important questions, I think, in terms of organizing, that you have to have the right people in the room for what your organizing goals are. And again, whether it's by turf or issue or whatever it is, get the right people in the room. And if you don't have the right people, then try to recruit more of the right people instead of trying to speak for them.
So that, at this point, we're still just like ground laying, right? So let's move to the actual work of organizing and some of the strategies. To lay the groundwork, organizing means engaging with society, doing, not just thinking or talking. And that's from a set of organizing tools that the Green Party of the United States has available. We talked about Lee Staples in his book Roots of Power earlier with the turf identity issue, breakdown of strategy. Organizing is a bottom-up philosophical approach to social change, not simply a method to achieve it, right? Organizing is action. Organizing is doing things. It's not a method, it's a process. And then from Abby Hoffman, the key to organizing an alternative society is to organize people around what they can do, and more importantly, what they want to do. That's one of my favorite quotes from Abby Hoffman. During the Occupy movement, I was heavily involved in our local cell, and my roommate wanted to get involved. And so she would come to me and say, Chris, what should I do? And I would say, what do you want to do? And it was a point of heavy contention between her and I, because she had no experience as an organizer. She felt overwhelmed. There was too much that she wanted to do. And what she wanted me to do was to say, do this paperwork, do this process, give her a specific task, right? But I know that she's not going to be interested in taking notes at every meeting, right? Even though that's a task we need done. And I know that in order for us to build a dynamic and viable organization, she has to be engaged in ways that she cares, right? And so we would have, literally, where she'd be shouting and going, just tell me what to do. And I'd go, just tell me what you want to do, right? And I wouldn't do that to a normal person who just came to a meeting, right? That's my roommate. So I was pushing her a little harder, to engage critically. But it's really important that when we're organizing, that it's hard work and it's not always enjoyable, right? But we should be passionate about it, and we should be having a little fun from time to time, even in losses. So another kind of framework for thinking about organizing, right? We on the last page we talked about, it's not just thinking or talking. It's not simply a method. So what is organizing? And according to Jane McAlevey in her work No Shortcuts, there's a differentiation between advocacy, mobilizing, and organizing. And you see a lot of this play out in the not-for-profit, industry, in the not-for-profit complex, right? So advocacy is supporting others, right? That's supporting the Sierra Club to speak on your behalf in favor of the environment, right? So you support others to create social change on your behalf, and it's based on the idea that elites with a seat at the table can influence the current system. Yet it doesn't usually involve ordinary people doing things, right? Again, to use that example of fracking in Illinois, Sierra Club members trusted the Sierra Club to protect the environment, but the leadership of the Sierra Club traded their mandate on the environment to have a seat at the table, and in the end, rubber stamped a fracking bill that most of their membership wouldn't have supported. Right, the advocacy gave all of the power to elites, which is problematic and very top down. But it's also the model of most not-for-profits, right? Most not-for-profits want you to send them money, sign their petition, and support their work, not do your own work. What they will sometimes do is mobilize, right? Protests, rallies, attending a city council meeting, inward base building oriented, and it's limited to those who support your cause, right? So ideally, what the Sierra Club should have been doing in Illinois, rather than going in the back room and supporting the legalization of fracking, they should have been out front calling their members to come to the governor's office, right, to join the sit-in that was taking place, to take arrests with other activists that were taking arrests, to make a point that we wanted a moratorium on fracking, not legalization, right? But a lot of the kind of the extent to which not-for-profit, most of these issue-oriented orgs will do is to mobilize people, get a hold of the people who already agree with them, tell them to show up at this place and this time for this event, right? Organizing is a fundamentally different thing. It's about actively working to change the minds of who disagree with you or who are not engaged in your cause, right? It focuses on mass movement of ordinary people, and the base is expanded through education and training, and you let leaders emerge organically, right? Very quickly, when you start organizing in relatively small groups, leaders will on different issues and in different areas of work will almost always emerge, right? Rather than saying you do this, you do this, you do this, start working together and see whose skills, whose aptitude serves for different things. But the key is trying to engage people who aren't already on your team, right? As an organizer, you do plenty of mobilizing, right? You do engage in that work because you want to turn out the people that you have, but you also want to grow the number of people that you have. And that's where this is key. And while I'll also say, because we're talking about local parties, that interpersonal one-on-one relationship, that's where you can change people's mind, right? When you talk to your neighbor over a series of weeks and months and years, you can actually change their mind on issues, right? It can happen. When you shout at a random person on the street or on social media, you never change. It's almost zero-sum game there, right? It's just not going to happen, right? But on the very micro level, we can actually make these changes. And I think one of the more important, where we as, socialists and Greens operating within the U.S. political system need to focus here is not so much trying to convert Republicans, you know what I mean? Which is possible. I've known Republicans who are flipped, who things in their lives and relationships have changed their worldview in drastic ways. But Our focus should be on the largest block of voters every single election, the ones that aren't engaged, non-voters. They're the biggest opportunity we have. Most elections, they're the majority of the electorate, right? We don't need to flip a minority of Democrats, which are in a minority party, to gain power. The math doesn't work there, right? Our power is through organizing the disengaged, the alienated, right? They're not apathetic, right? They've just been lied to and screwed over by every politician of every stripe. And so they've rightfully said, I'm not going to participate in my destruction anymore. I'm not going to, support someone who's just going to stab me in the back. And they're struggling, right? The working class is struggling. So they have limited time and energy and resources to actually engage. But they're also the ones with going back to what we were talking about with material change, they're the ones with the material interest to change. Right? They want to see it. So that's who, when we're talking about organizing, in my opinion, that's where our laser focus should be, right? The non-voting communities, people who have been completely alienated and left behind. When I was a community organizer in my town, I was working for a national campaign that was a front for SEIU healthcare union. And they wanted us to do this huge anti-Romney rally on the day that he was declared the presidential nominee in 2012. And I'm arguing with my bosses in DC, and I just kept telling them, no one in my neighborhoods cares about Romney. The worry isn't that any of them are going to vote for Romney, because they aren't. What they're going to do is they're not going to vote because they have a Democratic city council member, they have a Democratic state house member, a Democratic state senate, a Democratic governor, a Democratic U.S. rep, a Democratic Senate, U.S. Senate rep, and a Democratic president, and their lot has gotten worse, right? The danger wasn't that they were going to flip to Republican. The danger was the very real reality that they were going to stay home. And so we really have to build those trusting relationships. And this is also where it's really important that we differentiate ourselves, right? Why are we any different? How are our policies going to end up any different? If we're just another gradation, a shade, a 1% shade left of Bernie, we might as well join Bernie. But we're not, right? Eco-socialist Greens are asking for a fundamentally different program than what capitalist progressive Democrats are. And we need to be able to express it, and we need to be able to sell it positively. And we need to, be able to use it to motivate it as we build the relationships to, get these non-voting communities engaged.
Yeah, I agree. And I want to throw in real quick here that mobilizing versus organizing is not an either or. It's not that you would never do mobilizing because, as it points out here, mobilizing is a base building activity. It activates the people that are already on your side. It gets them hyped up and interested. And, that's part of getting your wins out there, right? Letting your base know, here's the wins, here's the stuff you can get involved in. And so it's a very good thing to do. The problem is most organizations stop there and they don't move on to the organizing part, which is empowering the communities. And in particular, like Chris is saying, empowering the communities that feel alienated and have given up on this system. They don't believe in the duopoly anymore. They don't believe in electoralism because they think all that electoralism is the duopoly. They don't even believe in the nonprofit organizations anymore because those nonprofits team up with the duopoly all the time. So it's not that they don't care. It's that they're not sure even what to do anymore. So part of our task of organizing is to help, give them some encouragement, give them some hope, and say together, building solidarity and building a movement, we can actually build very important change, and we can make it happen together. And that our program is not just some tweaks to the current system, even if they're relatively good tweaks like what Bernie Sanders proposed. We don't just want Medicare for all and things. We want a system that's actually going to work for communities and for workers. That when we talk about empowering communities to make their own decisions and have self-determination, that should be not just within the Green Party, but that should just be how all decisions are made for local government and for your workplace and the economy as a whole. We want to empower people to have self-determination in all those aspects of their life, not just within the Green Party. And that is a big aspect of what makes us different from even the most progressive liberals, most progressive Democrats. We're talking about actually having self-empowerment in all aspects of life. So, we have to focus on that organizing aspect of educating and helping in solidarity, build the infrastructure and all necessary for communities to organize themselves. So, yeah, it's an important focus. So, don't forget mobilizing, but organizing is really where we need to go.
And as we engage, the general public, the working class, the non-voting majority, right? We have to meet them where they are. We're going to meet people at various levels of engagement who support us, right? Some people will find out what you're doing and will watch from a distance, right? They'll like your stuff on Facebook. They'll retweet you. They might send you $1 here or there, right? Some people are going to see what you're doing and are going to hit the ground running and organizing, right? They're going to come in and they're going to go 100 miles an hour as soon as they step foot in the building. And those people, one of the things we might need to do in terms of meeting them where they are is getting them to step on the brakes a little, right? Tempering them back a little. Hey, don't burn out, right? Don't come in here and try to save the world in a day and then get frustrated and leave, right? Both the people who are at a distance who we need to pull in and the people who hit the ground running and want to go 1,000,000 miles an hour, we may need to temper, right? But we got to meet them where they are and help to develop them as organizers, right? That's I think people tend to think that, the organizer's key job is, going out and, based on the last slide, converting people. But really the organizer in a bottom-up movement, the organizer's main job is creating new organizers, right? It's creating people so that you can all of a sudden hand off the thing that you were doing and go do something else, right? And now we've got two people of skill working in different directions and expanding our reach. People are more apt, and we said this earlier, to get involved in organizing if the opportunities align with their skills and their passions. They're less likely to show up if they're simply tasked with a job that no one else is doing or that they're not interested in. You need to make sure that you're engaging people in ways that are appropriate for their interest level and skill set, right? I know a lot of people kind of shy away from political involvement because they say, well, I can't go out to a protest or a rally for whatever reason. No, there are a million ways to be involved, right? And none of them require you going out and, knocking on a door or going out and carrying a protest sign. And those that do it aren't doing any more important work than you may be doing on the back end, running the database, right? That database thing is something that Greens need people to do, right? We have lists, but we don't actually manage them, right? If a list manager in any local that could really start using our list to connect with people and give us information and give us, educated leads on things would be, huge in any local. And it's not a job that requires you to go out, right? Same thing with someone writing press releases, someone doing social media, someone doing outreach, doing phone banking to turn out for your mobilizations, right? So we've got to make sure that there are people, that we're engaging people in ways that are appropriate for their interest and skill level, and we're not trying to pigeonhole people into doing the things that we want to do, where we need people.
Yeah, I've seen this happen locally where things will be on the back burner that are considered important, and then someone comes in and says, oh yeah, I could help with a press release, and so somebody else goes, here you go, here's like 12 that we were thinking of writing, good luck with that. and
swim.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the easiest way to turn people off and push them out of the party, right? It should be you should really have tough conversations about maybe this is a thing that we shouldn't do right now. Maybe we should focus on our 1 or 2 tasks like we talked about. You start with a couple of things, and then you can expand out as more people get involved. And when you do expand out, it needs to be more of a mentorship thing. Like, as we've said repeatedly, Organizing is really about creating new organizers. And the way that you do that is you mentor them, you guide them along the way. You say, hey, you said you were interested in press releases. How about we talk about that? How about we put together a press release together? I'll show you our lists of press contacts. I'll show you how to send an email through Nation Builder, whatever tools you're using. And then you can train people. And then not only do they feel more comfortable and welcomed into the party, but now they're building skills and now they feel confident and now they can go off and do that organizing work on themselves. And you can move on to mentor a new person or to do whatever else. So keep that in mind to don't burn yourself out, but also don't burn out new people, especially in the early stages. Pace yourself.
And don't leave people to sink or swim, because a lot of times people will just sink. Right, like Garrett said, like when someone wants to do something, match them up with someone who has the skill set to train them how to do it. Right, set them up for success. That's something as a former Montessori teacher. That's something we always talked about, was setting our students up for success.
Yeah.
And if we set them up for success, they're going to keep succeeding.
And this is an important spot to point out that. If you're a new group with just a few people and none of you in your initial group are sure how to do a press release or whatever it is, that's again where you should reach out to your state party, the national party, whatever, because we can try to put you in touch with people who can help you develop those skills.
Yep. Well, no matter how I feel about the national party's focus on press releases, there are trainings on how to do a press release, right? Whether I think that's the best use of Green's time most of the time is a whole other discussion, but the resources do exist.
That was an example, but yeah, we have trainings on a few different topics and we should develop a lot more training. So if you let us know you're interested, then we know what sort of trainings to work on.
Yep. And it's important for us to, understand, not in addition to the we've mainly been talking about skills, right? But everyone's in a different phase of their evolution politically. And as a third party, many of the people who are coming to us are coming as they're changing trajectories, right? This is why political education and democratic processes are essential, so we can work through political disagreements and develop a common foundation and perspective, right? When we're organized, I have bad news for the internet left, right? When we're organizing the working class, we're going to find a lot of reactionary sentiments, a lot of reactionary habits, a lot of reactionary opinions that they have picked up, right? These are bad habits that we need to help them break. Right now, the internet left tends to prefer cancelization, right? And I'm not someone who whines about cancel culture, right? But it's not going to work when we're doing on the ground organizing with the working class. If we just write off everyone who disagrees with us, we're going to find ourselves with a very small group that's never going to be effectual. What we have to do is build these relationships, build these trusts, build education programs that can address these issues, build training programs, have long, deep conversations, and help people evolve politically. And then once we start doing this, all of a sudden we find out that these education programs and these discussions have given us a really strong common foundation, and now we're organizing more as a unit and more in step with each other. So when we meet people where they are, we mean both, in terms of skill level and politically. We've got to be able to have these hard conversations. We've got to learn successful tactics and strategies to God, I hate that I'm going to use this word, but deprogram people, right? I really don't like that term, but it works here, right? And we've got to be better at it. We've got to actively apply ourselves to it. We're just going to find ourselves, spiraling into a smaller and smaller and smaller group. And that's in many ways, the history of the left in this country, right? In the last half century, what we have seen is not, an expression of mass solidarity on the left, but as a mass sectarianism, as political organizations split and fracture into a million pieces, and now we're many pieces instead of a unified whole. So it's really important that we're meeting people where they are, and we're working to develop them. Not only as organizers but as humans. One way to do this in a simple way is the ladders of engagement. Now, the what we have on the right in the image is kind of a social media ladder, but we used it because it gives kind of a good understanding about how you step through ladders, right? But ladders of engagement are a system designed to develop supporters into organizers, moving them through a series of steps and roles, right? So on the right, it starts with people who would view your stuff on social media. Next, it would be like, they're not only seeing it and liking it, they're sharing it, right? Followed up with that is like, now they've moved beyond sharing our stuff on social media, and they signed our contact form, and they want to volunteer and do work for us. Next up, they're giving us money. They're donating to us. Now they're giving us money regularly. They become a recurring donor. And then you move them up to what they call advocate, right? And this is kind of the problem with this example, is it ends at advocacy, right? Whereas we're going to move them all the way up to organizer, ideally. But what you want to do is you want to find different levels. In Illinois, for a while, we used a ladder organizing model where when we had a new person, we wanted to engage them as a local organizer. And then from there, we wanted to, if they were ready, we wanted to step them up to a county-wide organizer. And then from there to a regional organizer, and then from there to a state level, and then federal level, right? So we started people as local as possible, and as their skill sets came out, as their passions came out, there are some people who are really passionate about issues that are more federal issues, right? So they may jump all the way up. We may meet them, start talking, and go, you know what? You're really good on Medicare for all, and we just want you to run our Medicare for all, working group, and skip the other stuff, right? But that's another model that you can use, is moving people up in the kind of the number of people and the scope that they work with. Like I said, there's numerous ways to set this up, but the basics are that people fall on different levels of support when you meet them, and then you want strategies to move them upward. And people may plateau as well, right? There are people who just want to give you money and don't want to give you anything else. There are people who just want to go to a rally and they won't show up for a business meeting, right? But you want to identify where supporters are and have a strategy to try to move them. Like I said, this can be used in person or with digital, and some databases kind of have a way to do this programmed. It can be really nice for, Garrett signs up to learn more about the Green Party. He gets an immediate thank you email. 2 days later, he gets an email about our upcoming events. A week after that, he gets an email, about, how to get more involved. And that's all automated, and I didn't have to think about it. But the reality is, like with everything, the digital, tech, social media, these are all tools. They are not organizing in and of themselves. They're tools we can use to help us organize. So they've got to be feeding back into your real in-person, on the ground organizing. Another really important thing when we're setting up our locals and starting to organize, we need multiple engagement streams, right? Not everyone wants to go to a business meeting. It's essential that there are multiple ways for potential supporters and members to interact with us, both in long-term organizing and in initial access, right? You want multiple ways that people can meet you and be introduced to you and become a supporter. And then once they're involved, you want multiple ways that people can be engaged so that they can, be excited about what they're doing. So this basic 3 model that I'm using was used in Carbondale, Illinois by one of our locals in Shawnee. I think it's a really good model to a really basic way to replicate a multiple event, a multiple access points. First off is the business meeting. A lot of places, this is all that happens in the Green Party, right? A monthly business meeting. And if you don't like it, too bad. This is what we do. Business meetings are super important, right? It's where the operations of the party, it's where official decision-making takes place. It's important, but it can be really boring. And without proper planning and moderation, it can be really ungainly, right? Conversations can go off on tangents, and, a new person sitting there going, what the hell are we talking about? Like, what am I doing here? What did I just spend these last 2 hours of my life doing? And then they leave and they never come back. right?
Especially if they're not. Sorry. Especially if they're not familiar with like Robert's rules or something like that, and then
Or
there's all this.
consensus.
Yeah, exactly. There's all this process about like I make a motion and I second it, and if you've never been exposed to that sort of thing before, it generally is how a lot of municipalities work. If you actually go to like city council meetings or something like that, but then who goes to city council meetings to watch the business meeting? Most people are there just to know if their particular issue is passed, right? They're not like taking notes about the the legalese, right?
Yeah.
So but it's important to do those things, but at the same time, it can, without the right context, it can be really confusing and boring for new people. So you'll want to push new people probably to number 2 and 3 on the list first.
Yeah. So number 2, the second thing that the Carbondale Shawnee Greens did was it was called Green Drinks. It was at a local bar. I will say I personally very much encourage people not to do it at a bar. I know people like to drink and it creates a good social atmosphere, but alcohol plus politics are a bad mix. Alcohol plus politics plus people who didn't come there for your event can be an even worse mix. And having it in a bar excludes people. It excludes minors. It excludes people who don't drink alcohol for whatever reason. But the core idea of a social event is a great one, right? It's really low resource. You don't really have to do a lot of work for it. You just put up a Facebook event. You declare that you're all going to meet at this place and at this time for a social hour. And it gives people an informal place that's a really low level access point, right? They can meet, they can discuss, green politics with you in a relaxed setting. They can ask the questions that they never get to ask at a business meeting. The other side of this is I'm personally of the opinion that the best ideas often come in unstructured times, right? We have our business meetings and we do good work, but it's sitting around at the restaurant after the meeting when someone says, hey, what about this idea? And then a great idea comes out, right? That didn't fit into that business meeting. So it's this really low access point that allows people to just come and socialize with you, come get to know you as people, come get to see that we are not, the extremist violent commies that were, made to seem that people would portray us as socialists, but that we're normal people and that they actually agree with us most of the time. Right. And so you've got that low level access point, but you've also got the informal structure where questions can be asked, where ideas can be thrown out and rejected or accepted. Right. That is not the formal time. This is the social hour is when the hey we shoulds should come out. Hey we should doesn't have a place in a business meeting most of the time, in my opinion. If you're at the business meeting, you need to have a concrete idea, not a vague what if we. The vague what if we at the social event lets people go, hey, that is a good idea. Let's start thinking about it in a more concrete way so we can come to the business meeting with a clear proposal. Far too often, not only in the Green Party, but in other organizations, I've heard, what could have been great ideas pulled a million directions because they weren't actually formed, but they were brought to a decision-making body that had to make it yes or no. And it was no, right? When it could have been yes if we'd formulated more. And then the third area that I would suggest is educational events, panel discussions, workshops, film screenings, right? Popular education discussions. Educational events allow great opportunities to work with other organizations and build those relationships, right? If we want to do an educational event on democracy reforms, that's an ideal opportunity to invite fair vote, despite the fact that we have major disagreements, right? If we want to do an educational event on climate policies and the eco-socialist Green New Deal, that's a great time to bring in Sunrise Movement, even though they are a de facto front group, right? These are times that we can very much develop these collaborative relationships. They also widen the group of people that we might meet, and allow us to dive deeper into issues and work things out as Greens. And earlier we had said we really need to differentiate ourselves, right? A Green versus a Sunrise debate on Green New Deal is an opportunity to do that, right? It's an opportunity for the Green to say, look, all your proposals are about paying corporations to do better. Whereas an eco-socialist Green New Deal is about public solutions. It's about public ownership. It's about the socialization of major industry. These are not comparable policies, right? We have a much different vision. Same thing for something like Medicare for All, right? Medicare for All is great, but we also need a national health service, right? Otherwise, the Medicare for All becomes a feeding trough for private providers, for private pharma, for private medical device manufacturers, right? So we can use these to get our policy out there, right? We can use this to differentiate ourselves. We can use this to cast a really wide net, right? Because Garrett might not come to something on democracy reforms, but hey, he'll show up for Green New Deal, right? And so, and then someone else won't show up until we do something on their particular niche issue, right? And if you go to our Green Party, if you look at our old Green Party 101s, or you come to our Green Party 101 next month, you'll hear us talk about the fact that Greens are, one of our problems is that we're historically a coalition of issues activists, right? If you meet a Green, you'll find out that they most likely have a niche issue that they are very into. And so these educational events allow you to, month after month, cast this very wide net and hopefully get a hold of people. And by offering multiple access points to the party, we widen our scope of potential members and supporters. And then the actual organizing of these events gives our people, our present supporters and our present organizers, ways to get involved and things to do, right? When we do these workshops on various things, Garrett and I are pretty much always say, if you have an idea for an issue you would like to do a workshop on, get a hold of us and we'll help you, right? And so that's very much the case with these locals, right? When you're running these education groups and someone says, hey, we should talk more about permaculture, cool. Welcome to the team that's planning the permaculture education event. You can, have a position on it. You might know the right people, the right experts to bring on to have the conversations. You can help us compile resources that people can look at, and you can help us, come up with action items, right? So not only does it give us access to more people, but it gives more opportunities for our existing organizers to do work. So, the big one. Deep canvassing and recruitment. Howie said, do more listening than preaching. And that's extraordinarily important, right? But deep canvassing is about having long, repeated conversations to build trust and relationships. And it may eventually, it's a path to eventually shifting their opinions. There's research shows that door-to-door canvassing, as we do it now, right, where the politicians just show up and they talk at you, or in my case, they get thrown off my porch. I'm literally labeled in the Democrats' van database as hostile husband on my wife's account because I've thrown them off my porch. But there's no effect on that, almost nearly zero effect on voting choices. Knocking on doors and preaching at people is not changing people's minds. But other studies have shown that having deep conversations where we're listening have much, much, much more impact. And, one study showed that 10-minute conversations could reduce transphobia, right? But you got to have the hard conversation and not just go out there and say trans rights are human rights. If you don't agree, you're a transphobe. You're not changing anyone's mind when you do that, right? You have to have these conversations. And deep canvassing is far more effective than any other type of political outreach. Flyers, mailers, speeches, rallies, yard signs. Yard signs are the quintessential political tool but research shows they have zero impact. They don't change people's minds. They don't get you votes. What they do is make your current supporters feel like they're doing something and like they got something for their support, right? You give them the yard sign, they put it in their yard, and they say, look, I'm supporting a candidate. Not really, but it makes them feel better, right? And it makes them feel like they got a sign out of their support. The Australian Greens engaged in deep canvassing before their, for a couple years before their most recent election, and they saw massive gains, right? They saw huge gains, like I think 2 to 4 times as many people elected to their national legislature, right? As a result of doing this deep canvassing. And it's because they went out into their community as Greens and they had the hard conversations and they moved people. Tips on deep canvassing: it's got to be more than one encounter, right? Repeated contacts, check-ins. And this is why when people ask me, I say start with your neighbor, right? I talk to my neighbor probably every few days when we happen across each other outside. Those are valuable touches that build our relationship, right? Even in the times when we don't get into something, that's important, when it's just talking about how he loves watching my toddler run around the yard, right? And grow up, right? That builds our relationship, which is really the underlying thing that we need to have, to get these changed. And this means we got to start early. And it's got to be 24/7, 365, right? We can't just start. If you're working for a campaign right in 2022, right now, it's too late and not, it's not worth it to start deep canvassing almost, because you've got a little over a month, right? It is not enough time to build the relationships you need. It's listen, right? Listen to concerns and try to relate those concerns to your platform, right? Don't ask leading questions. Don't try to, force them into a position. Listen, right? I often tell people that as organizers, our job is to make connections as people talk about things, right? So one of my examples that I used today, actually talking to someone online, another Green in Illinois, if I'm talking to someone in my town and they complain about the quality of the roads or the sidewalks, I immediately can talk to them about, well, are you aware of the situation with the city's budget, where Public Works and the police department each put in approximately the same budget request every year? The police department gets 99.9% of their request, and Public Works gets 30% in 2022 at least. Your roads suck because we are over-investing in authoritarian policing policies, right? These two things are directly connected because they compete for funding in the city. So by hearing these things, I can redirect them to to the larger questions, to the larger underlying systemic and structural problems, right? When Garrett hears someone talking, about the smell and the new smell they're smelling in town, he's got the knowledge to say that's the new plastics factory. Did you know they're going to build 3 more? Right? And you can make those connections. And, did you know if you can smell it, it's probably more than smell. It's pollution and it's damaging, right? So we can take their local, their specific interests and help make the connections to bigger things, right? And then as we build these conversations, as we build these relationships, we can start to make asks, right? And you start out with, mobilizing. Hey, I'm going to be at city council this week talking about, why are we paying $250,000 for a shot spotter system that doesn't work? We've had all these conversations about how we're overfunding the police. Can you come out and lend your voice and fill the room, right? And then as time goes on and on, you can make these bigger asks like, hey, I need help phone banking for this. Can you do that, right? And you can use the long-term relationships are key to getting those yeses when you make the asks. It's a hard thing. We're actually working on trying to figure out how to, put a good guide on deep canvassing out. Because it's one of those things that it's not the political mainstream, It's not how things are done right now, so the resources aren't as much there. That steel industry we talked about, right, from William Foster. Recruitment methods, ways to think about how you bring in new people. Individual recruitment, and you can use a chain system here. Illinois has an ongoing membership drive, and it has the slogan of "Bring a friend." And the idea is, if everyone brought one more person, we'll double our size. And then if everyone brings one more person the next year, we'll double our size again, right? And it's called the chain system, where members recruit their friends, their neighbors as new members, especially recruiting individuals that are in allied organizations to build mutual solidarity, right? But one way you can recruit is just to recruit one person, right? You have this conversation with your neighbor, it builds until they're a member. There's open recruitment, having public meetings. This could be your green drinks, right? This could be your educational thing. This can be a rally. This can be a Ask a Green event, right? But you invite the general public to the meetings, have current members ready to immediately enroll people. You can invite new folks to either an onboarding before the meeting or pull them aside during the meeting to get that individual, right? The open recruitment brings them in, but then you still need to do that individual recruitment to pull them in, to get them oriented properly, to get them onboarded into the organization. One problem Greens tend to have is, hi, welcome, we don't have anything specific that you can do. So why would someone come back, right? Great, I sat through a 2-hour meeting. I didn't understand what you were talking about most of the time because it was all inside baseball. And when I said, what do I do next? You say, come to the next meeting for more inside baseball. And then you never see him again, right? So even when we do these open recruitments, you got to move back to that bottom level individual, right? And then there's mass agitation. And mass agitation is kind of the mainstream norm in politics right now, right? Slogans and publicity and printed materials, going on podcasts. One thing that doesn't happen is mass meetings and educational programming, right? So there's an opening there for us in mass agitation because the Democrats aren't engaging in this, right? They're not doing mass meetings, especially not Democratic ones, and they're not doing much education programming. And when they do education programming, it's one directional. They're there to tell you what the problem is and why they're the answer to it, right? When it comes to mass meetings, I think that there's a really important point from Foster, and that's one good mass meeting is better than a dozen indifferent ones, right? So if you're going to engage in this mass agitation, you've got to make sure it's quality. Socialist Alternative has a really good kind of design and materials group that works within them, right? It allows them, when they do memes and graphics on the internet, they're professional, they're well done, they're thought out, right? Too many times from green campaigns, I just did you make that with clip art? Like, really? And so it's like, if you're going to do mass, you've got to make sure it's quality. Otherwise you're putting out, mediocre or worse work to the masses, and you're telling people you're not serious, right? So if we're going to engage in mass agitation, we've got to make sure it's quality agitation. Some recruitment tips. We said this earlier, listen. As a socialist organizer, your job is not to recite leftist theory at someone. Your job is to listen to their problems, hear their concerns, and help them make the connection from individual concerns to broader systems of oppression. This requires meeting them where they are and not trying to drag them before they are ready, and being patient and consistent in our messaging. Forgot messaging there in the text, apparently. Next up is show up, and not just election time. The key to building a bottom-up working class party is relationships that need to be built on trust. We talked about how working class communities are suspicious of politicians and political parties. They've been lied to time and time again. So in order to overcome this, we have to show up. We have to build trust. We have to be reliable, right? We have to show up not only for our own work, but for the struggles of the community as a whole. And we need to be present in our community year round, right, in the struggles, not just during election season. So when you're talking to your neighbor, right, and you're building this relationship, and you've got them agitated to come, to city council, and they're like, yeah, I'll totally come support you when you call out the shot spotter system that doesn't work. You've also got to be listening to what they're talking about, they're doing, right? And when they're showing up for even when they're not yet showing up for your stuff, you've got to show up for theirs, right? Put skin in the game. Once people see that you're there, that you're going to stand in the streets and fight with them, the path to trust is a lot smoother.
I have a good anecdote on this one where one of our who became very active in our local Green Party, he started helping with a lot of events and proposing actions and all kinds of stuff. He became a very active and respected member of the local party. And one day recently, I had talked to him about, like, how did you actually get involved in the Green Party? I don't remember when you started. And he said, well, the Green Party always showed up in my community. And the Green Party was always at every time there was a rally against war or against, things going on in the city, the Green Party was there. And so he said, so I started feeling like, well, if the Green Party is always going to be at my events, I should start going to your events. I should go in solidarity with you. And so that's how we made connections. And some of our best organizing members were crossover people who are involved in community struggle, who saw us there, and they said, okay, I can trust the Greens to be somebody who's going to be there to support me. And so they got involved. So don't underestimate that. Be there for the community, and people will recognize that. They will notice that, and they will come on board.
Yep. There was definitely, points in time when it was just known if you wanted to do something outside the Democratic Party, you called me or a half dozen other people in our town, right? And it was because we had been there, we'd shown up at everything, right? We'd organized things outside of mainstream politics, and that created a reputation and that created trust, right? And people notice when you're there for them, and they notice when you're there for them whether they're there for you or not, right? And it creates this radical solidarity that can grow into something real, and it can actually act as a hell of a fertilizer for the recruitment process, where all of a sudden somebody jumps on board real, like Garrett kind of said, right? You jumped on board real quick, and all of a sudden, a million miles an hour running, right? They hit the ground running. And why did that wouldn't have happened if they didn't feel that the Green Party was an ally and a natural place for them to do their work. Some tips as you're formalizing: avoid the tyranny of structurelessness. An organization without common policies, without even the means to establish common policies and actions, is not decentralized, it's disorganized. So to that end, adopt some formal bylaws, set a democratic decision-making process, whether that be modified consensus, which is popular in the Green Party, or Robert's Rules, which is popular outside the Green Party. Define membership, officers, duties, responsibilities, have elections, right? Have a conflict resolution plan. Set membership dues and a fundraising plan so that you can sustain yourselves, right? All of these are really important. I always tell people not to, especially with bylaws, not to get too hung up. They're incredibly important, because you don't want to be setting a rule in the middle of crisis, right? You want to have an idea already in place on how you're going to deal with things. And an example I'll give is the Illinois Green Party was having an event, and we expected disruption. We knew that people were going to come and try to disrupt. So before the event even happened, we had a democratic conversation and discussion about what we were going to do when the disruption happened. And frankly, the disruptors didn't know how to deal with it, right? But when they came and they started disrupting, we immediately shifted into our predetermined course of action, and it shut it down, right? They really were, they didn't get what they wanted because they weren't able to sow the chaos that they were hoping, right? It's in that chaos that a disruptor can can be opportunistic and succeed in and actually disrupting. And so when we knew they were coming, we had a democratic decision, we had a vote, we decided how we were going to deal with it. And when it happened, I remember when it happened and everyone turned to me, and I was in a kind of conflict of interest position in the time. And I said, I can't say anything, but we made this decision, right? Like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. And when I reminded them, it's like, we did make this decision and they acted on it, right? So having that stuff up in place is really important. The same thing goes for leadership, right? You want to know when new leadership's elected, how new leadership is elected, right? You don't want the first people in the room to just be able to occupy the seat indefinitely. So you need to have this kind of stuff worked out. And then how are you going to deal with conflict, right? And this is a left-wide, a Green Party-wide, a society-wide problem, that we don't have mechanisms and processes for dealing with conflict democratically and respectfully. And so we often can fall apart when conflict comes because we don't have a path to resolve it. Yeah. Anything on those, Garrett?
Yeah, I wanted to point out that I apologize, I can't think of the author offhand, but The Tyranny of Structurelessness is a really great essay for everyone to read here. What's that?
Joe Freeman.
Joe Freeman, there you go. Yeah, it's a really great essay. If you've never read it before, you should definitely read it. It comes from the lived experience from the feminist movement. And to kind of summarize the article there, if you don't have a formal structure, then your organization is going to be taken over by informal hierarchies. People are going to come in and kind of sit in positions and say that they're in charge of that, or they're the gatekeeper for it, or whatever. You'll end up with a lot of problems that way. When people butt heads over, who should make the decision and how the decision should be made. If you don't have those formal rules, different people are going to have different ideas, and they're going to say, oh, I'm the one that makes that decision, or I'm the expert, or I'm, and like Chris was saying with the disruptors will take advantage of that to say, well, I see some disagreement here, and so maybe it should be this way, and it can cause a lot of, at a minimum, hard feelings, and sometimes really derail all of the actions and good stuff going on. So it's really important to have some process to resolve conflicts democratically, and to have a structure in how you make those decisions, how you act on those decisions, who are the officers that act on those decisions, how are they elected, things like that, because it really helps you minimize arguments and make sure that you've decided things ahead of time, because deciding things in the heat of the moment is very chaotic and very hard to do, and especially very hard to do democratically, making sure that everyone has a say in it. So read that essay and think about it. And as I mentioned kind of at the beginning of this, most time when you talk to your state party or the national party, there's a simple bylaws like template that we can give you. So don't stress too much about having to write it on your own. Just be familiar that that's an important step to make once you've done the basic groundwork.
Yep. Yeah. And similarly, your state party should be able to help you with, your database, your CRM, right? In Pennsylvania, they'll hook you up with Nation Builder. In Illinois, we'll hook you up with Action Network. In Ohio, they'll hook you up with, I think they use Civi there, right? So they can help you get connections, right? Similarly, in Illinois, if you start a local, we'll immediately give you a space in Basecamp, which is our project management our project management system and our communication system. We don't operate by email or anything. We use a system to do that. They're called Basecamp. And then the same thing with getting set up with tools for doing digital engagement and stuff like that. These last few are just kind of tips, right? And we'll probably burn through them pretty quick because we're running long, clearly. But Organizing in elections. The balance between movement, organizing, and electoral work has been a tactical struggle with the left in the US. The Green Party is literally split, right, into two parties over this. It's this whole big story that's pretty awesome and awful at the same time. But we must not see it as an either or debate, but two parts of a larger strategy. As we said earlier, electoral campaigns have a finite lifespan. They have definite beginnings and ends. But organizing work is never done, right? We're always organizing. We're always adapting. Green organizations must have a plan and a strategy to transition folks from campaign work into long-term party engagement and organizing after the campaign has ended. And this is an area where Greens need to do a lot of work, where we're not so successful, right? This is even in my own state, right? We'll get a boom, a boon of engagement out of a campaign. We'll have, campaign volunteers doing really amazing work, and then the campaign ends and they don't come into the party and do that work. They just kind of disappear. We've really got to, have a strategy to get around that. Green campaigns can often build trust in relationships and trust in the community, which can then be used to establish a base growing our organizing efforts. And it's a two-way street, right? Your electoral campaign for city council can activate new people and can bring them into the party. And then they end up supporting your movement campaigns, your issues campaigns that you do, all the time. And the other side is you can meet new people through your issue campaigns and your movement work, and then transition them into supporters electorally. So it's a two-way street. And we need to be thinking of these not as too often on the left in the US. It's electoralism or movement work, right? It's electoralism or dual power. It's electoralism or mutual aid. In reality, we need to be doing both, right? They're different parts of the same strategy. And that strategy is, building a bottom-up mass movement. There are times when there are some people who will be moved by an electoral campaign, but not an issue campaign. And there's some people who will be moved by an issue campaign, but will never show up for a candidate, right? So we've got to be doing it all. That doesn't mean every person needs to do everything, right? You need to let people find the work that appeals to them. Organizing as an introvert. Here's some tips for those that are more introverted or private and not as comfortable in big spaces. Hold online meetings, even chat rooms, right? Even informal interpersonal chats can be huge. Provide written feedback ahead of in-person meeting. Ask the facilitator or chair to read it. If you prefer not to speak, right? It doesn't happen often in Illinois, but we have definitely had, people send in statements of support or opposition to things that we would be discussing in a meeting, whether that be because they didn't want to speak or because they weren't able to be there, right, in person at the time. You can do support work like graphic design for flyers and social media. You can do database and admin work. There's so much stuff as an introvert, right? The Green Party can keep you deduplicating lists for years without ever leaving your computer, right? We've got work if you never want to leave the computer. We've got work if you want to hit the streets, right? We're fighting a total capitalist system that is active on every front. And that's something I didn't say in the last, electoralism or movement work on the last one that I think is important. Like it or not, the present system has sequestered a whole lot of power in electoral work. So as the left, we can't just ignore it. We have to engage, even if it's not our primary focus, right? So much power in our society is tied up in electoralism. So we have to compete on that front, right? We can't just abandon it to them and abandon that power. But that was a little tangent. And then when meeting in person, meet for specific activity and not just meeting or an unstructured social time. You can do community cleanups, tree planting, sign making. Sign making is always a good one, right? It allows people to engage in a rally even if they can't attend the rally, whether that be by choice or by, conflict. Game nights, social stuff, right? And remember, you're welcome and wanted in the movement. And organizers, you need to consider how to make your organizations more inclusive, right? If someone can't show up to a meeting, that shouldn't mean they lose their voice. There needs to be a way for them to still, have a voice in the democratic processes, whether they're in person or not.
Yeah. One small thing we did in our Pittsburgh chapter is that we happen to use Slack as our internal discussion tool. So, it works kind of like a forum. And separate from the usual business meeting and all, we would have like every Friday at lunchtime, there would be the lunchtime Slack discussion. And we would invite everybody to get on Slack for, 30 minutes or so around noon and just chat about what's going on in the party or, locally or just whatever. And that gave people an opportunity to get involved and share their ideas, even if they couldn't attend the meeting for, various reasons. And it gave an opportunity for people to leave feedback in a very inclusive way through text and all, instead of where sometimes, even just me and Chris, it's very easy when you have a meeting or especially a Zoom where you accidentally talk over each other and things like that. When you have forum threads that you can follow, you can make sure that everyone gets their comment in there, and then people can kind of respond real time. And I think it was very successful to do something like that. It really helped build some bonds between people, because you would see people in the chat, once a week. And then when you got together at the social and all, you had some more things to talk about. Like, oh, I liked your comment on Friday. You shared that meme that was really funny, and whatever it was, right? So I just want to throw that out there, something that we've actually used successfully, if that's interesting to you.
10 things to remember. You will make mistakes, do the best to correct them and move on. Assume nothing, follow through on everything, check and double check. Make decisions, don't agonize and wait for a perfect solution. Campaigning is a social process. People like to be asked for help and thanked for help. In small races, the personal will usually dominate. Issues matter more as the size of the campaign grows. That one in particular, thinking about my most recent city council race, I publicly advocated for the Republican. It was nonpartisan, but everybody knew he was a Republican. He was a homelessness advocate that worked for a faith-based homelessness organization. He lived in my neighborhood. I'd spoken to him many times. I knew him, pretty well. And I also knew the Democratic candidates, one of whom was an accused rapist by multiple people, and the other of whom was a very conservative, very pro-police Democrat, right? And so that was a pretty, that was an incident where the personal overtook, ideological alignments. In no way did I want my city councilor to be a rapist. On the other hand, I knew this Republican personally. I knew that he cared about the community. I knew that his work was oriented towards helping, those who needed the help. And it was a pretty easy decision for me, to advocate for him. And it was completely a personal decision and not a political, a personal thing and not a political thing, because I knew the candidates, right? I had met and spoken to all of them on numerous occasions. The campaign that keeps on offense without being offensive will usually win. Super important in issues and in, electoral campaigns. If you let the outside world redirect you at every opportunity, you're never going to have a clear vision, right? You're never going to have a clear messaging. You're never going to have a clear path. You have to adapt and address things as they happen, but you also can't let that derail you. That was a big struggle. During the 2020 campaign of a national presidential campaign, when we'd said we're going to talk about, I had said the 2 weeks before, this week we're going to talk about carbon drawdown and how we can pull carbon out of the air and into the atmosphere and into the soil to to reduce, the climate dangers. Well, but then something would happen, right? That might disrupt that campaign, but we couldn't just drop the campaign. We had to, address both. So that's important, really important to balance. All politics is local, translates issues into local terms. One campaign does not make or break a movement. A losing campaign can provide the basis for winning the next time. And we're saying campaign, we are, in some ways talking about electoral campaigns, but also issues campaigns, right? It's not just about, you're a candidate. It can also be about, a policy or a position or a movement for an issue. Campaigns should be fun. Look out for each other and avoid burnout. When I was a dual member with the Socialist Party USA, we had a local chapter, and our local chapter chair started every single meeting by asking every single attendee, how are you? And how are you doing? And we had a rule, and it was Chris can't say he's fine. Because my answer would be, I'm fine. And she would push me. And the real answer was, I'm overwhelmed, I'm overloaded, and I'm just pushing through, right? But that's my normal state as a political organizer. So I would just say, I'm fine, and she wouldn't let me. She'd make me have that conversation, and then we could talk about what needed to come off my plate. What could somebody help me with, right? So we've got to make sure we're looking after each other through a sense of solidarity in a theoretical term, through a sense of love and compassion on the interpersonal side, right? And a campaign is a chance to show who you are and what you're in favor of. Use every opportunity to show how grassroots campaigns are different from politics as usual in the two old parties. And this is from How to Run a Grassroots Election Campaign and Win by Krasner. Like we said at the beginning, a lot of this stuff is oriented towards specific types of stuff. But I think all of these ideas can be applied to any movement or issue or electoral campaign that you want to that you want to take on. And that's the end. Only 2 hours and 40 minutes this time.
A long video, but maybe people appreciate the long podcast. So thank you for sticking it out if you've listened the whole time.
Yeah. So thank you. Thanks everybody for coming. We do these monthly, right? We talked about that. You can reach out to us at greensocialist.net. This workshop is the end of our third session our third series of 101s. We will be resetting next month. So October, you'll see Green Party 101. November, you will see Eco-Socialism 101. And we'll be back in December for another updated version of this Organizing 101. Garrett and I haven't talked about dates, so we don't have those set yet, but we'll get those set real quick. You can, give us a week maybe or so, and we'll have the new dates up on greensocialist.net/101s. This is a recurring series, so we're, at least through the end of the year, going to keep doing it, and we might, reevaluate. But, I think I really enjoy doing these workshops. I honestly think it's probably some of the most important work I do in the party with these 101s. So thank you for joining us. We will see you next month for Green Party 101.
That's right. And we've been adjusting each cycle. So if you have any comments or something that you don't think has been addressed in previous iterations, let us know and we'll tool our next batch.
Yep. Yeah. Like the last two sessions we did on eco-socialism. Session 2, we focused really heavy on the question of what is capitalism, right? To establish a clear foundation on, what are we talking about when we say capitalism? And then the third one that we did last month, we focused really hard in on what is socialism, right? And what are some models of socialism and things like that. So we definitely adjust these as we go. We talked about at the beginning of this one, right? And the previous Organizing 101s had been very theoretical. This one we tried to orient more towards like first steps in, forming the local. And, we took those theoretical sources like Lee Staples and Foster and Jane McAlevey, and we inserted them at appropriate points, so we were able to hopefully give context to the previous months, the previous sessions from 3 months period, or 3 months previous is, the content that we talked about. I'm excited because next month I'm going to be doing an in-person organizing 101, I think, for the Illinois Green Party. So it'll be fun to see how that plays out. Like Garrett said, you can reach out to us. You can reach me at chris@howiehawkins.us. That'll go straight to my phone and I'll get back to you. That can be with feedback or questions. Also if you're wanting, to have us come and do a version of this, right? It can be really scaled back or it can be really focused, but I think Garrett and I would both be, more than willing to Skype into your next local or state meeting, and help you have these conversations in a little more directed way than, us just talking with a slideshow on Facebook and YouTube. You can reach out to us, and we're more than happy to help, figure these, help get you more plugged in, and get you more direct support as we do this. So thank you, everybody, and we will see you next month.